right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here. All right. Welcome to today's webinar, Making the Workplace Inclusive with Freddy Rolon. I'm Susan Waldman, Senior Manager of Membership and Publications at NAMIC. Today's webinar is part of NAMIC's Fireside Chat series with Next Generation Leaders. A Next Generation Leader is an emerging business leader of diverse ethnicity in the media and entertainment industry. This person has been honored for both their career successes and their commitment to fostering diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Today's honoree is Freddy Rolon, SVP Programming and Scheduling at ESPN. He's an ELDP Class 9 alumnus, and he sits on NAMIC's Board of Directors. Our moderator for today is Freddy's colleague of over 18 years, Santa Brito, Senior Director of Communications at ESPN. Santa is an accomplished leader with over 20 years of corporate communications and consumer marketing experience. She spent most of her career working in communications initiatives centered around ESPN's multicultural business strategy. In her current role, she leads communication strategy and media relations for soccer properties across the Walt Disney Company's functional teams. And she serves as the communications partner to ESPN's diversity, equity, and inclusion team. During her tenure at ESPN, Santa has played an instrumental role in shaping how ESPN connects with the Latino community. A proud Afro-Latina, Santa was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to the US at the age of 13, settling in the Bronx with her family. All right, before we begin, some housekeeping notes. This program is being recorded and we will send a copy of the video to share. Please add your questions in the Q&A box throughout the program and feel free to chat with one another in the chat box. We're going to run a video highlighting Freddy's career, and then we will get into the program.
Freddy for a long time, and I've worked with him on so many projects and networks and that type of thing. And he is a relentless, just cheerleader and representative of the diversity discussion as well as the U.S. Hispanic business. And he's always the one, just challenging people to make sure, like, are we considering the diverse audience? Like, are we taking the risks that we should? Are we producing the content that we should? And he's, not afraid to push people on that. Like, he's not afraid to challenge people. Very few people in our company actually know this space as well as he does, and he's not afraid to go against the grain.
Freddy is a key member of the ESPN leadership team, and as ESPN's SVP of Programming and Scheduling, he influences fans by virtue of his job each and every day. Beyond his work in programming, Freddy has long served as an inspiration, mentor, and champion to employees at ESPN, sharing his personal experiences to help encourage and lift others.
So Freddy has never missed an opportunity to talk about ways in which we should be mindful of the diversity of our audience and make sure that our workplace culture matches that diversity. And he's been consistent as long as I've known him. He introduces high-end concepts for making sure that our content is rich and diverse, but he's also a great leader who identifies how he can help others stand up in this moment. So he just is a living example of what it takes to do this work in a business environment. You need certainty and you need the ability to communicate. Freddy always works with facts and stats, real information that is actionable. And then he just is a great example of what it means to have somebody who can come in from a different perspective and be a leader.
Honestly, when I first heard that he was getting this award, I thought, well, it's about time. Freddy is this incredibly unique leader and has always made sure that he is in the middle of every conversation with regards to diversity and inclusion. And if he cannot be in the middle of the conversation, he has empowered his team to make sure that it's in the core of everything that we do on a daily basis.
I can honestly say that I get lifted by Freddy He and I have worked very closely together over the years, particularly in this conversation about making our workplace inclusive. And his determination and his consistency lift me up on days where it's harder for me to get going. He is an amazing teammate. And I really do admire the example he sets. You know, he's a peer, but I look up to him.
All right, Santo, hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. You know, every time I see that video, takes me back to last year at the NAMIC conference. Freddie, I know we're going to get a little bit into that later, but you know, seeing you being recognized by NAMIC in that stage and just hearing what our colleagues had to say about you was definitely by far the most special part of the conference for me. But anyway, well, thanks so much again, Susan. Thanks, Anne-Marie, Sandra, and our friends at NAMIC for being such an incredible partner to ESPN. I am really thrilled to be moderating this discussion with Freddie and let people into the leader that I have had the privilege to be working with for the past 18 years. This is particularly special for me because I consider Freddie sort of like part of my own personal board of directors. You know, he has been there for me as a mentor, as a sponsor. He has been there for me as a confidant, and has supported me in my career, my journey here at ESPN. So, Freddie, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Thank you, Santa.
This is your virtual stage. So why don't we go ahead and just jump right in. So, Freddie, you were born and raised in the Bronx. Your parents are from Puerto Rico, and I have heard you talked about growing up just 5 blocks away from Yankee Stadium. Tell us your story.
Well, first of all, I feel like it's a little bit of a trick. You guys played that video. I almost feel like it set me up to cry, right? Like it's such a privilege to have people from ESPN kind of speak about me in that way. Totally right. I grew up on 164th and the Grand Concourse, which was, I think, 5 blocks away from the old Yankee Stadium. It's probably a little bit closer to the new Yankee Stadium. And, you know, I grew up with sports in my background, as you say, or I should say in my backyard, right? My parents were both from Ponce and Salinas of Puerto Rico. So I grew up not speaking English until I entered the New York school system in kindergarten. And you can, you know, I don't know that everyone has had the privilege of growing with like a major market team in your backyard like I did with the Yankees, but I used to say that you could tell how good the matchup was by how many people were in the neighborhood, right? And so all of a sudden, on game day, there'd be a whole bunch of people, and the line on in the deli was a lot longer on game day versus when it wasn't there, right? And so talking about sports and kind of hearing about sports was something that I just grew up with as long as I can remember. I'm not sure that I always associated it with my future career, especially when I was little, but it was certainly something that was constantly in the background for me. And so very personal. It's been like, we talk about it often, like my career to me was a little bit about unlocking what my superpowers are. And to some extent, some of my superpowers come from my time in the Bronx and the ability to speak Spanish, to connect sports to life, to kind of see how that sports influence people. I feel like I had a front row to just seeing fandom early on and how it worked for people, including my dad, who's a huge Yankees fan, and kind of passed that on to me when I was very young.
Freddie, I definitely want to touch a little bit on the superpower. I love that comment about you finding out what your superpower was. But before we move there, can you just tell me a little bit more as to like why sports is so special to you? I heard you talk about your connection with sports and how you connected because of who you saw on TV. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think ultimately sports is really personal for me in a lot of ways, but one is just as a Latino growing up, sports was the first place that I saw others like me celebrated. Now, there wasn't any Rolons, but there was Rodriguez's, Rivera's, Bernie Williams, right? Like all these folks, not just identifying and speaking Spanish freely in front of other fans, but being celebrated by the general population of 50,000 plus in the stadium, right? And so I grew up watching what was Telemundo and Univision back then, right? And my media consumption was mostly in Spanish. So whether it was Belinda Está Viva or like the news, there was more of a bubble of Latinos seeing Latinos. Sports was the first place where I saw that kind of breaking out and people cheering for those. So like to say, while I wish there was a Rolon on the field, there wasn't, but it definitely allowed me to kind of see myself in them in a lot of ways. So that was really personal to me. And I also saw dads and uncles, they carried how Jorge Posada did, right? Like it was a special point of pride for them, how these athletes performed on the field. And then everyone knew everyone's nationality too, right? Like they're like, oh, he's Puerto Rican, oh, he's Dominican. Like there's just a recognition of those people look like me and they represent us. Sports was kind of the first place that I saw that. And so we talk about it, right? When we think about that video you saw and how the conversation about inclusion translates, to me, I already knew what the power of seeing yourself reflected was, because I experienced it through sports. And so the question for us from a media standpoint and a workplace standpoint is how do we activate that same kind of feeling amongst the workforce and then for our audience by reflecting our audience with people on air.
Yeah, well, I mean, the great thing about this, maybe there wasn't a Rolon in front of the TV, but there is a Rolon in a really key and powerful position at ESPN behind the scenes. And, those roles are just as equally important. So, we're really blessed to have you. So you started your career with ESPN, leading the U.S. Hispanic side of the business, and now you have a much larger role within programming. Did you always know where you were going, or was there like a gradual evolution in your career here?
I mean, for sure, no. If I went back like 5-10 years ago and said, hey, Freddy, you're going to be leading the team that decides what the schedule is for ESPN and ESPN2, I would have been like, Dad, no way, right? Like, I don't know that I had the foresight to envision where I am today. It has definitely been a gradual process, right? And as I think about like for other people, you just gotta be comfortable kind of, it's a little bit of pivoting and weaving. I spent, as you know, Santa, in a lot of time in different parts of the organization. I haven't been in programming for my entire career at ESPN. I evolved into that. And so I started in the international side, worked into the Deportes, spent some time in ESPN radio, moved a little bit into covering digital, came back to ESPN Deportes, and then find myself kind of back in the ESPN programming world. So I'm not sure even if you were trying to design what's your career to get to programming if you were at ESPN, that you would design it the way I kind of experienced it. But it is very much not necessarily what I planned, although I feel very grateful to be where I am. And I have an awesome team and we have done, great work together, but that's not necessarily what I thought I would be doing, 10 years ago, or even before that, maybe when I was a senior director in the ESPN audio world, right?
And I think that's really key, Freddie, because sometimes as we are, particularly for those who are younger in their career, maybe starting out in their career, there's this sense of, okay, I need to have my 10-year plan, and I started here and I'm going to be here. And it's not always a lateral, right? Or like a straight shot. It's really interesting the way you got to where you are today. You took some turns. So what from those previous roles that you had with ESPN, kind of like what skills did you use to get to where you are today? How did those roles prepare you to be where you are today?
Yeah. Well, first, to your first part of your question, if you even think back 3 years ago, and I'm sure this change is constant for everyone, I don't think anyone would have predicted that we would have been working from home for a significant amount of time, that there's a hybrid situation for a lot of us, that then we're transferring back. Like, all of that would have been impossible to predict for people, right? So there's an element that as far as you can plan, you can't predict everything. So to your point, like what I've focused on are what are my transferable skills, and looking back, because definitely hindsight is much easier to kind of look back and see. Certainly, like the ability to work within teams, to bring people together, to influence people even though they don't report to you, to kind of think about how you communicate issues in a simple way and talk to people about how we tackle those issues or kind of execute on solving them together have been my most important skills, right? And kind of thinking back to my life in the Bronx, I feel like one thing I learned early on from my mom, right? So I say this to a lot of people. My mom was a connector in our apartment building in the Bronx. So she was not perfectly bilingual, but she was bilingual enough that all the other families who didn't know English came to her to get advice on letters they were getting or other things that they received in English. It could have been the energy bill, it could have been the rent bill, whatever it was, they were coming to her. So I kind of learned early on this idea of like, we help each other, right? And so I've always approached, while I have my own team and I have a specific role, how do that interact with everybody else? And how do you think about the bigger organization and how you are part of that? And I think those kind of things have really allowed me, one, to learn about other parts of the business, even though maybe I was working on one specific one, to grow my network, because I've had an opportunity to work with different people throughout the organization. And then by those two, I've opened up doors that maybe I didn't see as potential doors to walk through early on.
So let's talk a little bit more about your current role in programming. So you were tapped for this role 3 years ago, just right when COVID began. We're now 3 years away from COVID. Just curious to get your thoughts on like, what do you learn about yourself? What do you learn about your own leadership style as you led your team through like such an unprecedented time in our history?
So it's a good question. So to give a little bit of background, right? My role is helping to plan the events and the studio programming on ESPN, ESPN2, ESPNU, ESPN Deportes. So we work with production, marketing, everyone to just kind of figure out how we maximize our networks. When I was joining this group, we were just kind of coming off of the complete shutdown of COVID. And I think we all thought, hey, it's getting back to normal. And so this is going to be easier because we're going to move away from films and other things and back into live events. And you could say that was anything but Santa, right? Like we came back, we started to get back to normal, but things were getting canceled left and right. So we planned, and then we'd hear 20 minutes before, we have to cancel this college basketball game. Like this NBA game is going to be in a bubble? How's that going to work, right? Like there were all these X factors that weren't there. And what I would say was we learned a lot about scheduling and all of that. We did, but it's also a lot of stuff that we probably will never, and I'm knock on wood, have to experience again. So it's not necessarily learning that helps us through the future. What I did learn that helps us through the future is that in times of crisis, most people rise up to the occasion. And so we had things that we could never have predicted, that we could never have planned for, but our team kind of figured it out and worked within production across the entire organization to make sure that as unpredictable as things were, there was always something on the network. There was always something that made sense to the fan and that we were maximizing things. All those kind of lessons and the ability to like rise up also created a tighter team, right? Because we went through the impossible together. And so coming out of it, we just probably knew each other way more than we would have, even if it had been a regular session and I had worked in the group for 2 years, right? It was also during Zoom, so I got to see everyone's kids in the backgrounds and got to learn them about them in a more personal way. But to me, the biggest takeaway from that early time was that there is more that people are capable of than they really give themselves credit for a lot of times. And sometimes unfortunate situations bring that out, but it's always, it's important as a leader to kind of recognize that, and that, you know, you got to key in on what people are capable of as opposed to what they're doing today.
That's great. Just want to remind everyone, if you can please drop your questions on the Q&A as we go along. That's great, Freddie. So want to talk a little bit about some of, over the past 3 years in this new role, what some of the moments or the work that you are most proud of since you were elevated into this new role?
So I feel, Santa, we are operating from a really position of strength, right? And in a world where we're talking about cable bundles and how that affects and viewership changes and all of that, we still have come out of that with, huge increases from a ratings perspective. We're seeing some of the best ratings in like 5-6 years amongst different sports category. We were up, I think, 16-14% amongst like P2 plus and 18-42 respectively in prime time. We have consistently been the #1 network for men 18-49, since I've been here and before. So I feel like we've just been able to kind of take the ball, as they say, and run with it. And that to me has been like, to just the sense that we've been able to kind of keep growing in a world where I don't know that that's the expectation, says to me like, probably what I'm most proud of.
Great. So I have one question here that came in through the chat from Justin. When do your best ideas come to you, and what do you do? And what do you do when the idea occurs? And I'm just going to ask if, please, if you can move your questions to the Q&A, that way I can just keep track of them so we can answer as many of them as possible. Greatly appreciate it.
So it's a good question, Justin. I don't know that they're like consistently coming to me at a specific time or place, right? What I do think is most consistent is there's really 2 times. One, either when I have quiet time, right? When I'm not necessarily busy or I'm not occupied by something else. I feel like ideas come to me through that. And then the second place, honestly, is through talking with other people, right? Like talking things out, hearing other people's perspectives. And a lot of times those conversations may not be about the problem I'm having or the issue that I'm thinking about, but as you talk to people, things come out and you find that a different perspective often helps you unlock ideas that maybe weren't occurring to you as quickly. So say those are probably the best examples of where I see ideas kind of come from. And then how do I enact on them? I usually don't right away. So I tend to just like stew on it a little bit. I think often what I guard against is you think something's a good idea right in the minute and you haven't fully thought it out. And so what I like to do is test it out a little bit, ask people maybe run the idea by some people, get their reactions, right? And then through that, I usually really just let it become part of what we're doing as opposed to letting the idea be the focus point. So hope that helps.
All right, well, thanks, Justin, for your question. I have one more question here for you, Freddie. So I want to move into representation and all the work that you have led here at ESPN from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. You know, here at ESPN, you are known for your passion for diversity from a content standpoint, from a workplace culture standpoint. What are some of the examples of the more important diversity discussions that you have been part of?
This is a good question. I mean, Santa, I think ultimately to me, the biggest, I've been kind of focused on a couple of things, right? One is our outreach and our connectivity, both to organizations outside of ESPN and Disney, right? So NAMIC is part of that. And the NAHJ, which is the National Association for Hispanic Journalists, the National Association for Black Journalists are also part of that as well. The Hispanic Scholarship Federation, all in the hope of creating more of a pipeline for us from a diversity standpoint, right? Those are hard conversations I've actively been part of. And then I think internally is a question of like, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera, are we reflecting our audience? And so I've tried to be a consistent champion of that where I could. And then ultimately what I've always tried to do is just make sure that I walk the walk as well, right? And so the second part of that, I think, is almost from a content perspective, because I do have an influence on content, has been thinking about where we can make a difference, right? And we've done things like taking Rebecca Landa and have her actually help call an NFL game in Spanish, right? We did that with Carolina de las Salas on the soccer side, which is to say we have these intelligent women who know about sports. How do we make sure that they are actively used in the best way possible and reflect female fandom, you know? And similarly, we had a conversation which I feel I'm really proud of, because I think from a media perspective, we were really the first ones to bring this to the space. We had a conversation about Somos Afro-Latinos, which was really a conversation about kind of the intersection, right, of representation of Black women, men in the Latino community. And that, how is that experience and how is it unique? We celebrate Roberto Clemente as a Latino always, but we've never really looked at that intersection and how it worked for him. And, you know, I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of heroes, and one of them was Juan Marichal, who used to tell me the stories about Roberto Clemente, and how when they would travel to the South, they would be amazed at how they were treated differently, and that it wasn't their experience where they grew up, but it was part of their experience when they were here in the US and lived, you know, they had reached their dream of playing for Major League Baseball. And yet they also went through the experience of feeling like not equal, right? And so there are times where we have, to me, that's, as I've kind of had an opportunity to influence, it's like, well, how do we truly reflect the audience? How do we truly bring out experiences that maybe have not been represented well in the past. And there is, it's, I say, there are so many firsts that still have not happened. It's sad, but it's an opportunity to get them out of the way. Like, let's get to 4th, 5th, 10th time that things have happened as quickly as possible so that it can be normalized and we can kind of be in a place where we're doing what's best.
Yeah, listen, I love that. And in my 20 years here at ESPN, I can tell you that being part of that group that worked on Somos Afro-Latinos is definitely one of the highlights of my career. For me, as as a woman, as a Black Latina woman in the US, we don't always see ourselves, right? So being able to be part of that group that open up that discussion to give our athletes an opportunity to really talk about that dimension of who they are was incredibly special. And that would not have happened had it not been because it started at one of your meetings with people brainstorming. So I have one question on diversity from Katina. What more can entertainment industries be doing to grow DEI efforts?
So it's a good question, Katina. I mean, I tend to think, and I have the perspective of this, like, we still have a long way to go. We have come a long way from where I was when I first joined ESPN in 2004. And where I see our success and where it stems from is tapping into the people that you have on hand. What I find is that you often, as an organization and as a leader, have the answers in front of you. It's a question of how you tap into the people that work for you and have them help you learn and figure out how to make a more inclusive, diverse workplace, right? And then where you can, where you have smart people, put them in positions of power that can make decisions, because that's going to help you grow quicker, faster, and in honestly a better way. And so I tend to think that this is not rocket science, and it's really a lot of things that are there for us, but it's people. And at the end of the day, it's not as easy, because it's not me scheduling something, it's me finding the right person to kind of lead, right? And so you have to kind of recognize that. You have to build your network. Sometimes you have to find someone that's not necessarily the organization and have them come help you. But usually, and as I've had the pleasure of working with NAMIC and being familiar with other parts of the media business besides ESPN and the Disney company, there are talented people in this industry all over the place of diverse backgrounds. And the question is, how do you tap into them to get more out of them for your organization? And if you focus on that, you're probably going to be more successful quicker.
Great question. Okay, so I have another question from Garth. I love this question. As a matter of fact, Garth, I'm probably going to borrow this question for some other panels. It's often said that the most important picture on the wall is the mirror. What do you see when you look at that mirror today versus 10 years ago? Whoa, love that.
I see more wrinkles, probably. Like, there's definitely more gray hairs in my beard. It's a good question. I mean, I think the way I would answer that, Garth, like, at the end of the day, there's a little bit of, you kind of have to know yourself, right? Like, you have to, every once in a while, take some time to self-reflect. It's not necessarily when you look at the mirror, but maybe when you do have quiet time. What I would say is, look at myself versus 10 years. What do I see? I mean, the experience has made me, I think, more empathetic to people. And I've learned a lot. Probably was more sure of my opinion back then. And I think now I'm sure that I'll find the right opinion by working with everyone else and not necessarily my own kind of strategic thinking or intelligence, right? So I probably am more thinking about me as a piece of a bigger world. And we talk a little bit about Santa because I know it was kind of on our topics to talk about, but what I feel comfortable when I see myself now versus 10 years ago is having a better sense of what I can control and what I can do versus what I can't, so.
Yeah, so let's stay on this topic for a minute. There are a couple of other questions on the chat, but I want to stay on this topic of authenticity. Freddie, I think one of your traits is that you always show up. It's the same Freddie, independently of what room you're in. You are incredibly authentic. And, I think it takes courage to be authentic and show up authentically in all of the spaces we're in. But it's also about vulnerability. How do you find your voice?
So it's been a journey, number one, right? I think shared with everyone a little bit earlier, like I didn't speak English until I was 5 or 6. I think with that has always come a little bit of an outsider mentality, and so, and reinforced through my experience and how I'll tell you, right? So being the one who spoke Spanish in kindergarten, everyone spoke English, I felt different. Going to private school during high school, coming from the Bronx, I felt different, right? I felt like an outsider. Certainly at Wesleyan, as kind of a first generation college student, didn't necessarily feel like I fit in. And then finally going to business school at Dartmouth, like there's not a lot of kids from the Bronx, Latino or otherwise, kind of in Hanover often, right? So consistently, I had the experience of trying to find my voice when I didn't necessarily know that or feel that my voice was like those that surrounded me. So not sure that I felt comfort in my skin all along the way, right? But I learned through that how to find comfort and also how to represent what I was feeling or what I wanted, even though I knew that it might be different from what other people were either experiencing or expecting. So I think as I think about me showing up authentically, it was a process of just understanding who I was. I mean, I hope like you saw through the pictures, I have fun. And I feel like I prioritize living in a way that I am enjoying what I'm doing, right? And that helps me just continually be myself. I don't feel at this point in my life that I have to be anyone else. And kind of connecting to the first part of what I said, like my life became that authentic, representation of my personal experience helped me unlock professional opportunities, right? I was bilingual, helped me to work on ESPN Deportes when ESPN was launching a Spanish language network. And Santa knows because she was there. There were not a lot of people in New York who spoke Spanish and could really influence or talk about what the direction of the network should be in those early days, right? So leaning into who I was opened up doors for me. And so that allowed, I think, as that continued to happen, right? The fact that I went to business school and had these skills opened up different opportunities for me at ESPN Radio. And so what I've experienced is like unlocking opportunities is really unlocking the capabilities and the person I am in a way that is as unfiltered as possible. And being yourself allows people to understand what your true strengths are, where you can help them, having different conversations. If you don't have them, there's not any experience that opens up. If you just kind of like stay to yourself, then you're just kind of going to be a very narrow road, right? The more you are yourself and people know, and they see not only opportunities for you, but for themselves and how they can work with you, it's just an easier path.
Yeah, Freddie, looking at you as a leader, and you talked about sort of like getting to understand where your superpowers are. To me, I think definitely by far one of your superpowers is how authentic you are, how you show up authentically in absolutely every space you're in. So we have another question on the chat. Can you talk about going back to your mom being a connector? I think this is a really good connection. So can you talk about the relationship, about relationships, building, maintaining, and cultivating them, and their importance in how you get work done every day? And that's a question from Christy.
It's a great question. So right now in my role, relationships are crucial. So I sit in the hub of the organization where I have to interface with sales, production, marketing. I mean, what we plan affects everything else that happens from a linear perspective, right? When I think about what I learned from my mom about connecting, and ultimately one of my bosses once told me, relationships are kind of like a living being. They're not static. They're usually getting better or getting worse, right? So two things I kind of learned. One is the more people you connect to, the better sense of the organization you have, the better sense of what's happening you have, the better sense of potential opportunities for us you have. That piece from a connector standpoint. From a personal relationship standpoint, what I've learned is you have to be flexible in how you work with people. You treat people all the same. That's kind of my kind of personal ethos, but you also realize that you don't communicate or interact with everyone the same, because people react differently and kind of communicate and hear things differently. I often talk to people on my team and they say, well, I said this, but the person heard something else. And so to me, that opens up the conversation. Like, you probably said it the same way you've said to someone else. You probably have to think about how you communicate that to that person, right? So think about relationships. There's a little bit of understanding the individuality of people, right? And then realizing how you interact with that, how you come across. I mean, relationships help you do the impossible, is what I would say. And it's definitely something that everyone should be focused on going forward. The more you know your peers and the people you interact with, the more you're going to get done, right? I think everyone probably has an example of when you know someone who doesn't work with you, but you have a good relationship, and you had a casual conversation, and you guys figured out something that hasn't been figured out. And you're like, well, we just solved it because we just had a good conversation. The more that happens, the better off we are.
I love that. So Freddie, when we were prepping for this call, we talked about self-advocacy, and one of the topics that I wanted to talk about. But one thing that really caught my attention is you mentioned the importance of, yes, self-advocacy is important, but also the importance of knowing who to advocate to. What do you mean by that?
This was like a great conversation we had, Santa, right? So ultimately, what I mean by that was more career focused, right? The context that we were talking about it was that I often have conversations with people at work or different parts of the organization where they keep saying to me, well, I talk to my boss about everything that I want to do, and I tell them that I want to do X and Y, and I'm in marketing, but I really want to work in content, or I'm in the digital group, but I really want to work in programming, and I don't see how that works. And in those, you realize, well, you're advocating to the wrong person. You want to do something that person can't really help you unlock. You want that person to open a door, but it's not a door that they have to open, right? And so when you're thinking about advocating for yourself, you do have to think about what you're actually asking for. So if you're thinking about a slight career change, a big career change, you should think about people that are in those areas that you want to work for. Those are the people you really want to advocate for. You might be putting too much pressure on your boss to unlock opportunities for you. They can have conversations on your behalf, but they can't unlock the opportunity necessarily. And so what you need to do is really find the person to advocate to that can open that door for you. Not saying it's easy, but it's certainly a better path than what I see a lot of people doing, which is hitting their heads against the wall, doing the same thing again and again, right?
Talking of that, want to spend some time talking about change. There's two types of change, the type that you can control and the type that you cannot control. How do you deal with the type of change that you can control?
So it's a good question because I feel like this is one of my main philosophies, right? And I'm going to give a little bit of an example because I think it helps frame the conversation. We are all going through moments of change, right? Like the industry is going through change, consumer behavior is doing change. So we are all, whether it's ESPN, the Time Warner Group, Discovery, like everyone is undergoing a moment of change. And what I often hear from folks is, well, I feel stuck because there's all this change and I don't know what the opportunities are. And what I try to say to them is there's really like 3 buckets, and there's variations on these 3 buckets, right? One is it's change and you're just all in. Whatever comes, you're gonna make the best of it, you're gonna figure it out. There's change and you decide to yourself, I'm not in for this change. I'm gonna go find something else that makes sense for me to do, that I'm gonna be happy to do, right? And then there's the 3rd bucket, which often is where people are feeling stuck, which is, hey, there's all this change. I don't like it, but I don't have a choice. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing and be unhappy about it. And I feel like what is important to understand is that 3rd one is also a choice. You've made the decision to stay where you are and be unhappy about it. It's not something that was forced upon you, right? And so really what you have to figure out is what it is that you can control. What is it that you can do with your actions to go in bucket 1 and 2? Because bucket 3 is not a healthy one to be in, right? And some of those people sometimes are on my team and I say to them, I don't want to lose you. But if I feel better if you're in bucket 2 and you go do something that you're happy about than if you're in bucket 3 and you're not happy. So figuring out what you can control is also a question of taking ownership of the choices that you are making, right? I can't control, to some extent, consumer behavior. It is what it is. I have to then control what we do to adjust our strategy to it. That's what I can control, right? Same, right? Like the other side is how someone hears what I say, I can't control. I can control that I ensure they understand me, right? And I can say it and make sure I check in and say, well, Santa, do you get what I'm saying? Like, how is this coming across? That's what I can control. And that Santa on the other side understands that I care that she heard and understands what I'm saying. So to some extent, when we're thinking about the change and kind of the industry and our organizations, there's definitely things that are going to happen that we can't control. And really the power we have is to approach it in a way we're comfortable with. And the only other part I would say there, Santa, because I think you've probably heard me say this, is that when you're in that 3rd bucket, you're just kind of stuck in a negative like part, right? Negativity never breeds positivity. The only thing that breeds positivity is positivity, right? You can make other people feel positive by being positive. If you're negative, I've never witnessed where someone else leaves feeling positive, right? So as everyone kind of goes through the change, just realize we do have choices and, just try to own them where you can.
Yeah, I love that. Negativity never breeds positivity. It's energy, right? So you talked a little bit about ownership. Are there any tips that you can give? What tips can you give? The participants on the webinar about owning their career?
So, I think as we all think about our careers and you think about owning them, that piece of ownership and advocacy is super important, right? Like, I think no one knows you better than you. And with that, even as a manager and as long as I've known someone, I don't know that I fully know what that person's aspirations, goals in life are, not just from a career perspective, right? So as you think about owning your careers, my advice would be to, one, be true to yourself, right? Like, go where you're appreciated, do what you want to do, make sure that what you do fills your tank at the end of the day as opposed to emptying it, right? So you're leaving with energy as opposed to feeling like you're sapped from energy at the end of the day. And then make sure that people know what you want to do. Share with them what it is. Now, there's going to be moments in time where you are happy with what you're doing. You may not in the moment have an aspiration, but also let people know that, right? Because I think things going unsaid are probably the worst way for you to own your career. Always do good work, always kind of like leave people understanding how you can like benefit you, your work benefits the organization. But at the end of the day, as much as we have mentors, advocates, your career is yours. And you're going to want to know, I don't know if you want to move to North Carolina. I don't know if you want to be in California. That may be a career aspect of what your goal is. And as an employee, I may just be thinking of you as like, well, he wants or she a higher position, or maybe she's better. Well, you might actually care more about geographically where you're going to be, right? And so those are important things to know about yourself, but then make sure that you're communicating to your bigger kind of community.
Yeah, I mean, goals do not manifest themselves unless you speak them out loud, right? And the more people you share your goals with. I remember that at one point in my career, I really wanted to work in consumer marketing, and I manifested that. And I remember having that conversation with you, and when the opportunity came along, I was able to move into a role in consumer marketing. But had I not raised my hand and said, hey, if there is a role ever available in that group, I'm interested.
Yeah.
So one question from Marinda on what did 10-year-old Freddy wanted to do when he grew up, and why?
Yeah, 10-year-old Freddy probably wanted to be a rock star and like listen to a lot of I think I was probably pretty good at doing like my version of the moonwalk back then and some other things. And like, I'm not sure 10-year-old Freddy was totally grounded in reality. He had a lot more hair and styled it with gel and was like, probably very much a dreamer, which I hold on to. But I am pretty sure I wanted to somehow be, in front of the camera or something at that point.
All right. So, Freddy, going back to, going back to being a mentor and a sponsor, you have long served as a mentor and a sponsor and a champion for many employees here at ESPN. But how have you benefited from those relationships?
So, two things. I think I had a professor at Dartmouth, Ella Bell, who once told me like, you have to have multiple mentors. There's no like even Luke Skywalker had Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Right? Like, it's not like you just have one person that kind of teaches you everything. And you should really think about how you tap into your overall network, right? And you should have kind of mentors who are dads and can help you understand as you grow as a parent, how to tackle things and how to think about things, or even just how to be patient and nice to yourself sometimes when you're overly critical, right? The same way as you have people who can give you advice. I could tell you one of the things I've learned is I probably spent a lot of time trying to figure out like who was like me that could be a mentor. And I wasn't very successful in finding like other Latinos in the sports business to mentor me, right? So I took it where I could find it. And so I could mention people like Trot Keller, John Wildhat, Norby Williamson, like even Lino Garcia, who was a Latino in the industry at the time. Like, all of them have given me important advice at different parts of my career. But it's been selective, like here and there. It's not like any of them were, and not because they're not great people, they are, but they weren't in a mentor in a way that it was like, hey, that's my mentor and he's kind of helped me figure it out, right? They were people who, in times of either change or times where I was questioning what's next, gave me really good advice that caused me to go back and change, do something differently, or initiate something that I wasn't doing. And so what I try to do when I'm in a position of mentorship is listen, right? And then share my experience, and then hope someone can take something from that rather than give them direct advice, right? Because what I've learned from mentors, and when you ask for help, even though you might think you want them to tell you, you really don't. You just want someone to listen, to give you perspective, and to like give you enough perspective that it makes you think about what's the right next step.
Yeah, well, Freddie, I have at least 10 more questions for you, but unfortunately, I see that our time is up. I want to, once again, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us. And thanks to NAMIC, thanks to Susan, Sandra, Anne-Marie, and everyone at NAMIC for your partnership with ESPN. And thanks to everyone who was able to participate on the call. Thanks, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Santa.